Good afternoon. It's Gary Sly and the Legacy of Handmade Objects. It's a beautiful sunny Monday afternoon, April the 29th, here in Leesburg, Florida. I'm in the shop this morning and I'm over on the side of the front of the shop where I do all my weaving. I've got my big 45-inch Harrisville loom up here that doesn't have any work on it right now. And today I'm working on dressing my little 24-inch Harrisville. I have two looms that I spend some time working on. I often describe myself as kind of an occasional weaver. I'm not always real busy with weaving. I spend more time with stitching. But I like to have projects on the loom. I think it's a great thing for people to see when they come into the shop. And frequently if you come in, if you're here and I've got something on the loom, I'll let you sit down and throw the shuttle a few times and play with the pedals and do a little weaving while you're here. So as I mentioned, I am working on dressing my little loom today. This is actually the kind of loom I learned on, and it's always kind of fun to come back to this. I find I really don't do huge projects. I typically do things like shawls, scarves, table runners, placemats, those kind of things. You can do great big huge work, and on the other episodes you've seen my big loom, but I tend to stick with smaller projects, maybe also because I'm working on them here in the shop. I want to talk a little bit about the process of setting up a loom. I'm not going to go into great detail. These are kind of things you want to sit with another weaver perhaps and learn, or at least check out some YouTube videos before you get started. Behind me here on the wall, you can see I have my warping board hung there. Just kind of back up a little bit so you can see that. Before you start the work of dressing the loom, you have to wind a warp, which means you use a board like this, or there are other methods that you can use to wind warps. There are warping reels and even warping pegs if you're doing a fairly simple weaving project on a rigid heddle loom. It's important for every weaver to learn how to wind a warp, and the point of the warp is using these two pegs here, either at the top or the bottom, to make sure that your warp threads have an X in them. Now your warp threads are the ones that go from the front of the loom to the back, or the back to the front, depending on how you dress your loom. And when they go on the loom, it might not look like it, but they are crossed. Every two threads is crossed. The best way I can explain why you have to do that is if you can envision a bunch of strings just hanging loosely. If you run your fingers down through those strings, they're going to go all the way from top to bottom without anything to slow them down. If you can manage to cross every two of those threads so that there's an X somewhere in that process, when you go to push down, your fingers are going to come up against the X place, and that's where it's going to stop. So your weft threads, which go from side to side, stop at the X, and it's that sticking place where the X occurs is where your weaving actually happens. Otherwise, your threads just pass on through and you just got a bunch of threads when you're done. It's kind of hard to explain it visually, because when you look at what I'm doing here today and you watch me putting these threads, these warp threads into the loom, you're not going to really see the X. But what I can tell you is I've got the warp threads here in my hand right now. And here's the X. There's one going that way, and there's one leg going that way. And this portion of the work on the loom is called slaying the reed. So you're taking the warp that I've wound on the warp board over there, and I'm using it to go through all these little teeth in the reed, which is one of the first processes that you use in terms of dressing the loom. I dress my loom from front to back. There's a huge debate in the weaving world about whether to go front to back or back to front. I'm not going to get into that debate today or at any point. All I can say is that I learned from Todd Gypsum up in Harrisville, New Hampshire, at the place where my looms were made, and that's the way he taught me. And I think most of us tend to weave based on the instruction that we got at the beginning. But there are wars fought over whether you dress your loom from the front or from the back. And as I say, that's not really an area I'm going to get into today. So this first part of the process is one that I like to do all by myself with nobody around and no interruption, because I've got the four legs of the X, if you can imagine them, here in my hand. And if I were to lay this down and those different strands were to get confused, then I would have wasted all the work that I did in winding my warp. It's going to be hard to see, I'm sure, because of the way this thread is variegated, but I'm going to alternate from left to right. I'm going to take a thread from the left side. Let's see if I can move this just a bit so you'll be able to see the work that's about to happen here. I'm going to move it just a little bit. And what I'm going to do, I've got this little hook that I use. I'm going to pass that through the tooth of the reed. I'm going to grab that thread from the X that I just identified, and I'm going to pull it through a couple feet on the other side. So I'm going one tooth at a time across the reed, and I'm doing the alternating threads from my X. I did one going to the left. Now I'm going to take the top one on the right side. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go back over here, use my little tool from the back, find the next hole in the reed, and pull it through. I'm using a 12 dent reed for this project, which means there are 12 dents or holes in the reed per inch. I've got 216 ends that I'm using here. And just so you kind of know where it's coming, because you'll probably see this in later weeks, this is the weft thread that I'm going to use. I'm going to use this color for the left to right threads that will finish up the weaving process. But you can see that my warp is a black and white variegated, almost looks like snakeskin kind of a design. I often say that I'm a novice at weaving. I've only been doing it about 15 years. And I say that because the guild that I'm a member of, Weavers of Orlando, has weavers who've been doing this stuff for 40, 50, 60 years. And I'm not so serious of a weaver that I spend a lot of time doing calculations and figures and all the rest of that before I start weaving. Because I have a shop, I'm lucky that I can go to the back, pick out some colors that I like, come up here, dress my loom, and have some fun weaving. And I don't really have to worry too much about what I'm using. If you're buying yarns retail and you're having to have those shipped to you, you're probably spending quite a bit of money on yarns. I have a discount yarn room where I sell everything for $6 a pound, but of course it's even cheaper than that for me as the owner. So I'll just play around with colors. A lot of time, more serious weavers, before they get to this process, will do sample weaving, maybe using a small tabletop loom or something like that, because you never quite know what the colors are going to look like. You're seeing the beginning of this process here today. Whoops, dropped something there. And you're seeing me put these variegated threads into the loom, and at some point I'll show you what it's looking like when I put those magenta weft threads in and we start weaving. But it'll be interesting to see what the color combinations look like, because they really are kind of unpredictable. Now I'm going to spend another hour probably or so slaying the reed, which means I'm going to go all the way across the reed from right to left, and each time there's a hole in the reed, I'm going to put one of these threads from the X. I'm not going to do the rest of that right now because that would be kind of tedious, but you can see that I've got my hand firmly gripped and closed so that the legs of that X don't fall apart. After I'm done with this, I've got 4 shafts on this reed, and on these 4 shafts, which go up and down based on the pedal movement of the loom, on each shaft are a series of these little metal kind of things, needle-looking things called heddles. And that's where my pattern is going to be developed. I'm going to take a combination of petals and heddles on the shafts. And that's how I'm going to decide what pattern I'm going to use. And if you look at, probably can't see the heddles, but in the middle of the heddle, there's a little hole. So each one of these 216 ends that I'm putting in the reed are eventually then going to be threaded into heddles. Once that's done, and that's another fairly tedious process because I've got to go all the way across from one side to the other with all 216 ends, I'm going to tie them onto my back beam, which is back there. You can't really see it from here, but I can show you I've got a front beam here. And once I've got all of my reed threaded, and once I've got all of my heddles threaded, and once I've tied onto the back beam, I'm going to roll my warp through. I forget, I've got a 12-foot long warp. So I'm going to roll that onto the back beam, and then I'm going to tie this end, the end that you can't see yet, onto my front beam. I know that's probably a lot of complicated information. I do want to say, and I say this a lot of time when weavers come into, or when prospective weavers come into the shop, even though it sometimes is a little hard to explain, it's really not as difficult as it might seem. When I first bought a loom, I didn't even know what the different parts of the loom were called. I happened to notice on the side of my loom that it said Harrisville Designs in Harrisville, New Hampshire. So I Googled that place and found out that they're still in business. They're still making looms. They're still making beautiful yarns. And I went up there and took an introductory weaving class. The fellow that I studied with, his name was Tom Gypsum. He's a commercial weaver. He has since retired and has had some health issues, but I managed to have 2 classes with Tom before he retired from teaching. I did an intro to weaving class and I did a tapestry weaving class. And since then I've gone back up to Harrisville and done a class with Linda Tellepete and her husband on Navajo weaving. So I would recommend, if you are interested in weaving, even if you don't have a loom yet, you might want to look up Harrisville Designs up in Harrisville, New Hampshire. It's a wonderful place to go. If you sign up to go up there for a week-long meeting, you can stay there in the old boarding house that's associated with the old mill, or you can stay in a local hotel or a bed and breakfast. It's just a wonderful experience, and you get a week to learn how to identify the different parts of the loom and dress the loom and choose color variations and do all the kind of wonderful things that weaving entails. Of course, there are other weaving centers all over the country. There are weavers' guilds in every corner of the country. So if you're interested in doing weaving, I hope you'll get in touch with your local guild. I didn't know such resources existed when I first bought my loom, but they're a wealth of information, and you've probably got weavers there who can do this kind of stuff with their eyes closed. You know, dressing the loom for me used to take 6 or 8 hours, including winding the warp. I can actually do it in a few hours now, and I suspect if I were really to focus, I could probably do it very quickly. But I do stress a lot of time when people come in, don't go buy a huge loom unless you have the opportunity maybe to try some of this out and just kind of see what's involved. And I am pretty convinced that weaving is one of those crafts that you need to sit next to somebody and learn. You can reinforce your learning on YouTube. I think there's a lot of information you can get about shortcuts and new ideas that maybe your own teacher wouldn't have to share with you. But because this craft is so involved in some ways, I won't say complex, but certainly involved, you're going to want to sit with somebody the first time you do it. I looked it up. The oldest weaving structure that we've found is about 34,000 years old. In Europe, I think it was in the former Georgia Republic of Russia, they found a scrap of woven material that you could tell actually had a warp and a weft. And from the very beginning, when people figured out the utility of weaving, they also figured out ways to put designs on what they weave. So it's a fascinating and ancient craft. I was shocked and surprised to learn that you can weave a structure on your loom that is connected on one side. So basically, if I've got 22 inches of weaving space, I can weave a 44-inch piece of cloth because I can connect it on one side as I'm weaving. You can also weave a continuous cylinder. So before the days of any other kind of sewing or connecting, you could weave a continuous cylinder like a sleeve or a pants leg or something like that, which just kind of reinforces how ancient and wonderful and traditional the art of weaving is. Well, I'm going to close for now. I hope that the ideas here haven't been too overwhelming. It's not that I'm all that complex of a fellow, but it's just a lot of terms and things like that. But I would encourage you, if you're at all interested in this process and you'd like to know more about it, feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with the people that I know. I visit weaving centers whenever I travel. I went to a beautiful one outside of Santa Fe a couple years back. I visited a nice one up on the shores of Lake Michigan in Indiana just last year. There really are some great resources around. If you happen to be in Central Florida, I'm happy to have you come in and sit at my loom and throw the shuttle a little bit. I'll dress this loom up in a few weeks. I'll come back and let you see how I'm doing in terms of progress. Anyhow, that's a good way to wrap up what I'm talking about for today. Hope to see you again soon. I've got the second part of that wonderful interview with Carol Kniepkamp coming up. I want to do some more of my series of the world religions and the use of stitching as meditative and religious practice. I'm going to do some more with that. So lots of fun things to do as we head into summer here in Florida. Have a great week. This is Gary Sly. Remember the legacy of handmade objects.